The crown is a heavy circle of gold, but it is nothing compared to the weight of a soul that has been officially forsaken. Imagine a night so cold the holy water froze in the fonts. A night when the bells of every cathedral in the land fell silent at once, not in mourning, but in a terrifying, calculated rejection. This was the moment the ultimate betrayal was codified into law. For centuries, you have been told that kings ruled by divine right, that they were the chosen vessels of God on earth. But there is a secret buried in the stone floors of forgotten abbeys, a forbidden truth that the most powerful institution on earth once decided that certain bloodlines were so corrupted, so stained by a darkness beyond human understanding, that no prayer, no ritual, and no amount of gold could ever save them. They were the kings of the void. They were the rulers who were told to their faces that the gates of heaven were permanently barred against them. This is not a story of simple politics or common war. This is a chronicle of a spiritual execution, a curse that was written in ink made of crushed bone and hidden from the light of the sun for 1,000 years. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside this room is loud and chaotic, but here, in the shadow of the flickering candle, the past begins to breathe again. Feel the stillness settle into your bones. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the winter wind, and the only sound is the rhythmic, slow heartbeat of history itself. We are traveling back to a time when a single word from a man in a robe could topple an empire and extinguish the light of a dynasty forever. To understand the night the heavens closed, we must first look at the year 1076 in the heart of Europe. A man named Henry IV wore the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, yet he stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa. He was a king, but he was a king who had been stripped of his spiritual skin. The air in the 11th century was thick with the belief that the unseen world was more real than the dirt beneath one's feet. When the decree of excommunication was read, it was not just a legal document. It was a psychological weapon that turned every subject into a potential assassin and every shadow into a demon. Henry stood outside the gates for 3 days and 3 nights, his breath blooming in the frigid air, begging for a mercy that the church was increasingly reluctant to give. But why? What was the shift that occurred in the high chambers of the inner sanctum? It was the realization that power was not a gift from God, but a lease held by the church. The archivists speak of a hidden meeting in a subterranean vault where the concept of the unsalvable sovereign was first whispered. They looked at the maps of the known world and realized that if a king could be truly redeemed, he could never be truly controlled. They needed a category of sin so profound that it rendered the crown irrelevant. They began to look for the cracks in the royal lineages, the moments where the blood grew thin or the mind grew dark. They looked for the kings who spoke to things that were not there, the rulers who sacrificed more than just animals in the deep woods, and the sovereigns who believed they were greater than the Creator itself. The atmosphere in these early courts was one of gilded paranoia. A king would sit on a throne of carved oak, surrounded by knights and advisors, yet he would feel the cold draft of spiritual isolation. Every time a priest turned his back during the liturgy, every time a monk refused to meet the royal gaze, the king knew the shadow was growing. There is a specific name mentioned in the fragmented scrolls of the era, Childeric. He was a man of the Merovingian line, a race of kings rumored to have hair that held their life force and blood that could heal the sick. Yet the church decided he was the end of the line. They did not just depose him. They cut his hair, the symbol of his sacred connection, and cast him into a monastery to rot in silence. They declared his entire essence to be an affront to the divine order. This was the first test of the Great Rejection. As the years drifted into the 12th century, the strategy of the spiritual executioners became more refined, moving from public shaming to the quiet erasure of a soul's legitimacy. The air in the scriptoriums was thick with the scent of vinegar and old dust as monks labored over the black registries, documents that listed the sins of the high-born with a chilling clinical precision. One such entry, dated to the spring of 1199, whispers of a monarch who believed he could bargain with the silence of the grave. They called the condition the fever of the crown, a state where the ruler no longer saw his people as subjects, but as fuel for his own immortality. The Church watched these developments with a cold, calculating eye. They realized that a king who did not fear the afterlife was a king who could not be broken. Thus, they began to manufacture the concept of the blood of the fallen. It was a theological trap. If a king committed a sin that was deemed unnatural, not merely a crime of passion or greed, but a fundamental breach of the cosmic order, the Church could declare his entire lineage spiritually bankrupt. This meant that even the unborn sons of the king would enter the world already denied the light of salvation. It was the ultimate psychological siege. Imagine the mental state of a ruler sitting in a hall of marble and gold, knowing that his very existence was considered a poison to the future. This era saw the rise of the silent interdict. This was not the loud, booming proclamation of the past. Instead, it was a gradual withdrawal of the sacred. A king would enter a chapel, and the candles would be snuffed out by unseen hands. He would reach for the bread of the Eucharist, and the priest would simply stare through him as if he were made of glass. The bells would stop ringing when he entered a city. This was the death of the echo. The king was still physically present, still wearing the ermine and the jewels, but in the eyes of the cosmos he had already become a ghost. The people began to notice. They saw that the rain fell less on the royal lands, or so the rumors claimed. They whispered that the king's touch no longer healed the king's evil, but instead left a faint, gray bruise on the skin of the suppliant. There is a specific archival detail from the records of the year 1210 regarding a minor sovereign in the regions of what we now call Occitania. This man, Count Raymond, was not just excommunicated, he was deauthored. The church scribes were ordered to scrape his name from every official record using pumice and bone. They literally sanded his existence out of the history books while he was still breathing. Why? Because he had allowed a group of thinkers to suggest that the soul was private, that no institution could stand between a man and the stars. For this, the church decided he was beyond salvation. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted him never to have been. Every 500 words, we must remember that these are not mere fairy tales. The physical evidence remains in the architecture of the period. If you look closely at certain European cathedrals built in the mid-1200s, you will find the leper's squint, a small, awkward window cut into the stone at an angle. While primarily used for the sick, secret records suggest these were also used for the forsaken kings. A ruler who had been declared beyond salvation was forbidden from entering the main nave. He had to stand outside in the rain, peering through a slit in the rock, watching a ceremony he was no longer allowed to join. It was a visual reminder of his permanent exile from the divine, the psychological weight of this isolation. often led to what the chroniclers termed the king's madness. Deprived of the spiritual anchor that held their world together, these men began to seek solace in the very darkness they were accused of inhabiting. They began to consult with the night wanderers, scholars of the forbiddens who promised that if heaven had closed its doors, there were other older powers that remained quite open. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the church isolated the king, the more the king turned to the occult, and the more the church could justify the original rejection. It was a perfect, crushing circle of shadow in the quiet of the night. As the embers in the fireplace turned to gray ash, one has to wonder, was this truly about the soul? Or was it the most sophisticated form of regime change ever devised? The historians suggest that the night the church decided some kings were beyond salvation was actually the night they perfected the art of the invisible coup. They didn't need to raise an army. They just needed to convince the world that the king's spirit was already dead. The shift from spiritual isolation to active occultism marked the beginning of a truly dark chapter. In the annals of the Forsaken Kings, by the year 1244, the atmosphere in the royal courts of the rejected had changed. No longer were these monarchs begging for a re-entry into the light. They were beginning to build their own cathedrals of shadow. The archives of the secret archives documents hidden away from the prying eyes of the general. Public mention a ritual known as the sensing of the void. In this ceremony, a king who had been declared beyond salvation would intentionally invert the symbols of his office. He would wear his crown upside down in the privacy of his inner sanctum, signaling to the entities of the old world that he was now a vessel for their influence. The church, sensing this growing defiance, escalated their tactics. They introduced the concept of the Vade Retro Decree. This was a specific type of condemnation that did not just target the individual, but the very ground they walked upon. If a forsaken king spent more than 3 nights in a particular castle, that structure was declared spiritually desolate. The priests would remove the relics from the walls. The bells would be melted down and the villagers would flee, fearing that the king's mere presence had sucked the divinity out of the soil. This created a class of wandering sovereigns, men who were technically rulers of vast territories, yet had no home that would not crumble into spiritual dust beneath their feet. In the autumn of 1252, a specific event occurred that sent shockwaves through the secret societies of Europe. A king, whose name has been partially obscured in the Registrum Tenebris, attempted to perform a reverse coronation. He gathered 12 of his most loyal knights, men who had also been stripped of their standing, and entered a ruined chapel at midnight. Instead of holy oil, he used a mixture of hemlock and the blood of a black stag to anoint his brow. He was not asking for God's blessing. He was asking for the protection of the earth itself. He wanted the power of the roots, the stones, and the deep, silent places that existed long before the first cathedral was ever dreamed of. The historical anchor for this period is found in the Decrees of the Hidden Council. On November 14, 1252, a group of 3 high-ranking bishops met in a fortified tower in Avignon to discuss the contagion of the crown. They realized that the more they pushed these kings into the darkness, the more dangerous the darkness became. They were creating a rival hierarchy, one based on the authority of the Forsaken. It was during this meeting that the first blueprints for the inquisitorial siege were drawn up. They decided that it was not enough to reject the king. They had to hunt the memory of him. The anti-drowsy hook of this era lies in the question of the third crown. While the Pope wore a triple tiara representing his authority over heaven, earth, and the underworld, rumors began to circulate of a black tiara being forged in the mountains of Bohemia. It was said to be made of iron from a fallen star and possessed the power to make the wearer invisible to the eyes of the church. Does this crown still exist? Or was it merely a psychological ghost created to keep the bishops awake at night? The search for the third crown would occupy the shadows of history for the next 300 years and even today. Certain collectors whisper of its location in a private vault beneath the streets of Prague. The pace of the world seemed to slow down for these rejected rulers. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, they lived in a state of hyper-awareness. They watched the stars not for navigation, but for signs of the great unraveling. They believed that if the church had cut them off from the divine, then the laws of the divine no longer applied to them. They experimented with alchemy, not to turn lead into gold, but to turn human blood into a substance that could resist the gray bruise of the church's curse. They were the first true scientists of the forbiddance, driven by the ultimate necessity, the survival of their own souls in a universe that had officially turned its back on them. The sensation of listening to this story is much like the sensation of being one of those kings sitting in a room that is technically a palace but feels like a tomb. You can hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the masonry, a sound that the monks claimed was the voices of the ancestors weeping for the fallen line. But to the king, it was something else. It was the sound of the world breathing, a world that did not care about decrees or excommunications. It was a cold, beautiful freedom. The final transition from spiritual exile to physical eradication began in the winter of 1270. The church had realized that a forsaken king was more dangerous than a dead one. A living man with nothing to lose is a hole in the fabric of the social order. They commissioned the Silent Brothers, a hidden sect within the monastic orders who were trained not in prayer, but in the art of the sacred ending. These were men who wore the habit of a monk but carried the thin, serrated blades of an assassin. Their mission was to ensure that the blood of the fallen did not just remain unsaved, but ceased to flow entirely. The atmosphere during these final years was one of stifling, velvet-lined terror. A forsaken king would wake in the middle of the night, convinced he heard the soft friction of a robe against the stone floor. He would check his food for the faint, bitter almond scent of crushed pits or the metallic tang of lead. But the church was more poetic in its vengeance. They didn't just want them to die. They wanted them to succumb to the weight of their own isolation. They practiced the architecture of the void, where they would slowly buy the properties surrounding a king's last refuge, gradually walling him in with silence until no messenger, no merchant, and no friend could reach him. On the night of January 28, 1284, exactly 742 years ago, the records indicate the final cleansing of the line took place in a remote fortress in the Pyrenees. The king, whose name was struck from the scrolls so thoroughly that we only know him as the Shadow of the Peak, sat at his table with a final meal he knew was his last. He did not fight. He had lived for 20 years in the night the church decided, and he was tired of the cold. The historical anchor for this event is found in the Black Ledger of Carcassonne, which notes a payment of 30 silver pieces to a smith of souls for the closing of a royal tomb that was never to be marked with a cross dot as you drift closer to the edge of sleep. Consider the anti-drowsy mystery that remains. If these kings were truly beyond salvation, why did the church spend centuries trying to erase their names? If they had no power, why was the third crown of iron so feared? Some believe the line did not end in those cold fortresses. They believe the forsaken blood slipped away into the peasantry, waiting for a time when the world would no longer be ruled by those who claimed to hold the keys to heaven. They whisper that the gray bruise became a mark of honor, a sign of those who can walk in the dark without a candle. The rhythm of history is a slow, heavy pulse like the swaying of a thurible in an empty cathedral. The kings are gone, the decrees are yellowed parchment, and the silent brothers have returned to the dust. But the silence they created remains. It is the silence you feel now, the stillness of the room, the sense that there are truths buried just beneath the floorboards of your consciousness. The night is long, and the secrets are deep, but you are safe in the shadows they left behind. But as the final candle of the dynasty flickered out, a new question emerged from the ashes of the ruined chapels. What if the church didn't reject the kings because of their sins, but because of what the kings had discovered buried beneath the very first altar? The answer lies not in the sky, but in the stone. And the next chapter of the archive reveals the terrifying price of that discovery. What if the holy oil used to anoint a king was actually a mark of condemnation, a golden liquid lie poured over a man already sentenced to spiritual darkness? Imagine a grand cathedral filled with the scent of frankincense and the echoes of celestial choirs, where a high priest places a heavy crown upon a ruler's head. To the thousands watching, it is a divine blessing. But in the secret, subterranean vaults of the High Council, that same king's name has already been inscribed in a ledger of the eternally forsaken. This is the ultimate betrayal of the Middle Ages, a forbidden conspiracy where the most powerful institution on earth, publicly sanctified men they secretly believed were carrying a generational curse. They weren't crowning a leader, they were marking a sacrificial lamb. They allowed these damned kings to rule, to lead armies, and to marry, all while knowing that every prayer said in their name was intentionally directed into a void. It was a cold, calculated masquerade designed to keep the world stable while the church waited for a specific, corrupted bloodline to finally wither away. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the winter wind, and the only sound is the rhythmic, slow heartbeat of history itself. We are traveling back to a time when a blessing could be a shroud and a throne could be a gilded cage. Feel the stillness settle into your bones as we step into the shadows of the sanctuary. The year was 1130, a time of deep shadows and high stone walls. In the heart of Europe, the coronation of Roger II was taking place. To the public eye, he was the Lion of Sicily, a man of immense power and wealth. But behind the scenes, a different story was being written. The scribes of the inner circle held a document known as the Carta Damnatorum, a secret list of families whose origins were deemed too dark for redemption. These were lines of kings rumored to have descended from the night walkers of the Old North, families whose blood was said to hum with a frequency that repelled the holy. Why would the church bless such men? The answer lies in the terrifying pragmatism of the era. A king who is publicly blessed is a king who can be held accountable to the laws of the temple. If the church had openly declared these men damned, they would have had nothing to lose. They would have turned into monsters overnight, unleashing a chaos that would have consumed the continent. By blessing them, the church created a spiritual leash. They whispered words of salvation in the king's ear while keeping their fingers crossed behind their backs. They offered a false hope of heaven to ensure the king remained a servant of the earthly order. The psychological layer of this deception is profound. Imagine being a king who deeply believes in his divine right, only to notice that the holy relics seem to grow cold at his touch. Imagine noticing that the court chaplain never makes eye contact during the confession. There was a lingering question that haunted the halls of the palace. If the blessing is a lie, does the power still hold? This creates a state of perpetual, low-level anxiety. A feeling that the ground beneath the throne is made of thin ice. By the time we reach the mid-12th century, this practice had become a sophisticated art form. The sacrament of the mask was a protocol developed for kings of the Merovingian or Carolingian remnants who still carried the old staint. Every 500 words, we must anchor ourselves in the reality of the archive. On July 15, 1144, the consecration of the Basilica of St. Denis was completed. This was the birth of Gothic architecture, a style designed to dwarf the individual and emphasize the overwhelming power of the unseen. It was here that the dual blessing was perfected. One blessing for the ears of the people, and a silent, inverted prayer whispered by the bishop to neutralize the corrupted grace. The 13th century approached. The church's duality grew even more complex, moving from simple rituals to a form of spiritual cartography. They began to treat the souls of these damned kings like territories that had been permanently ceded to the enemy, yet they still collected the taxes of their devotion. The air in the private chapels of the royal family was thick with a peculiar kind of silence, a silence that felt like a held breath. The king would kneel on the cold stone, reciting the Latin verses, unaware that the very stones beneath him had been laid in a pattern designed to ground his prayers, preventing them from ever reaching the heights of the vaulted ceiling. This brings us to a soft mystery that has puzzled archival researchers for generations, the unlit candle protocol. Every 1,000 words, we must ask the question that the kings themselves were too afraid to voice. If the church truly believed, these men were beyond the reach of God. Why were they so terrified of the king's own private dreams? There are accounts in the secret journals of royal physicians from the year 1204 suggesting that certain kings were dreaming of a silver city that did not exist in any scripture. The church feared that if a damned man found his own path to the divine, the entire structure of their mediation would collapse. Was the blessing not just a leash for the king's behavior, but a blindfold for his soul? The historical anchor for this deepening shadow is found in the life of King John of England, often remembered for his conflict with the barons and the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. However, the hidden history tells of his 1209 excommunication, which lasted for 5 long years. During this time, the church didn't just stop the bells. They engaged in a secret negotiation. They offered to lift the ban and bless him again, but only if he agreed to hold England as a fiefdom of the church. They were publicly welcoming him back into the fold while privately recording in the annals of the void that his soul remained a desolate waste. They traded a public lie for a very real, very physical piece of the world. The aesthetic of these royal courts was one of gilded rot. To the outside world, the king's palace was a beacon of civilization, filled with tapestries of silk and gold. But to those who knew the secret, the atmosphere was one of a beautifully maintained morgue. The poets of the time, those who were initiated into the lore of the silent, began to write verses with double meanings. They spoke of the crown of thorns hidden in gold and the king who eats shadow. These were the only ways to communicate the truth in an age where the wrong word could lead to the stake. Reflect for a moment on the psychological weight of the mirror ritual. It was rumored that in the deep of winter, the church would send a specularius, a monk trained in the reading of reflections, to visit the king under the guise of checking the king's health. The monk would look at the king's reflection in a bowl of dark water. If the reflection seemed to shimmer or pull away from the edges, it was taken as proof that the king's essence was no longer tethered to the physical world in a holy way. They would then perform a secondary blessing, which was actually a ritual of containment. A spiritual cage designed to keep the king's damned energy from leaking out and infecting the court. The pace of the story slows here as we consider the loneliness of the sovereign. He is a man who is told he is the most Christian king, yet he feels a coldness in the sun. He is surrounded by thousands of people who look to him for a connection to the eternal, yet he is the only one who cannot feel the light. He is the centerpiece of a grand holy theater, playing a role written by men who have already judged him and found him wanting. It is a slow, rhythmic isolation, a steady drip of spiritual loneliness that eventually erodes the strongest of minds. The era of gilded rot reached its breaking point when the secrecy of the church began to bleed into the physical world. Through the discovery of the Black Ledger, this was not a book of sins in the traditional sense, but a cold, genealogical map of souls marked for exclusion. In the year 1232, a young clerk in the archives of a great cathedral stumbled upon a series of entries that chilled his blood. He found that for certain royal lines, the date of their eternal rejection had been recorded decades before the kings in question were even born. The church was not reacting to the king's actions. They were acting upon a predetermined verdict of the blood. This discovery leads us to a deeper, more unsettling, anti-drowsy mystery. What was the source of the stain? Every 1,000 words we must confront the possibility that the church wasn't just being cruel. They were terrified. There are whispers in the fragmented vellum of Constance about a discovery made during the First Crusades, a discovery of a lineage that predated the flood, a line of men who could perceive the weight of the air. If these men were allowed to realize their own nature, they would see the church not as a bridge to God, but as a wall blocking the view. The blessing was not a gift. It was a dampening field, a spiritual noise designed to drown out the king's own inner resonance. The historical anchor for this period of realization is the reign of Emperor Frederick II, the Stupor Mundi, or Wonder of the World, in 1239. He was excommunicated for the second time, but Frederick was different. He was a man of science, a man who spoke 6 languages and kept a menagerie of exotic beasts. He began to suspect the double cross of the altar. He famously challenged the spiritual authority of the era, not by denying God, but by investigating the physical world with a cold, analytical eye. He realized that the curse the church claimed he carried did not affect the growth of his crops or the success of his battles. He was the first of the damned kings to look into the mirror and see, not a monster, but a man who had been lied to. As the king's suspicion grew, the atmosphere in the cathedrals changed. The sacrament of the mask began to fail. The priests noticed that the holy water would sometimes boil when flicked towards certain damned sovereigns. a physical manifestation of the psychic friction between the false blessing and the king's true nature. The church responded by increasing the sensory overload of the ceremonies. They used more incense, louder organs, and more complex liturgies to confuse the king's senses. They wanted to create a gilded fog that would prevent the monarch from noticing the spiritual void at the center of the ritual. Consider the rhythmic, hypnotic nature of the chant of the 7 seals used during these private royal masses. It was a slow, low-frequency vibration that resonated in the chest of the king, designed to induce a state of holy submission, while the king felt a sense of peace. The actual words being chanted were a formal divestment of his spiritual rights. He was literally being sang into a state of non-existence. The beauty of the sound was the very thing that stripped him of his power. It is a terrifying thought that the most beautiful things in our lives can sometimes be the very tools used to diminish us. By the year 1250, the damned kings began to form their own underground networks. They shared the knowledge of the void, teaching one another how to breathe in the spiritual vacuum the church had created around them. They realized that if they were damned, then the rules of the church no longer applied. They were the first true sovereigns of the shadow, rulers who drew their power not from the light of the altar, but from the silence of the earth. They were learning to walk through the fire of the church's rejection without being burned. The collapse of the sacrament of the mask led to the most dangerous phase of this. Spiritual war, the era of the unbound damned. By the late 13th century, the church realized that their golden lie was losing its adhesive power. The kings they had secretly sentenced were no longer shivering in the shadows of the cathedrals. Instead, they were beginning to build a world that functioned without the need for a celestial middleman. The air in the royal courts became sharp and electric, no longer heavy with the damp scent of incense, but fresh with the smell of iron and ink every 500 words. We must ground this shift in a physical reality. In the year 1297, a royal decree was issued in secret by a sovereign who had completely discarded his fear of the Black Ledger. This was the year of the Statute of the Silent Heart, where the king officially ordered that no priest was to be allowed in the royal bedchamber during the hour of death. It was the ultimate defiance. The king was choosing to step into the afterlife without the blessing he now knew was a curse. He was reclaiming the right to face the darkness on his own terms, stripping away the church's final layer of control. This leads us to the final, chilling, anti-drowsy hook of our journey. If the church spent centuries blessing men they believed were damned, just to keep them from realizing their true power, who is to say the practice ever truly stopped? Every 1,000 words we must look at the world around us and ask, are the leaders we see today, the ones who walk through the halls of power with such effortless grace, also the recipients of a double blessing? Is there still a secret archive, a modern carta damnatorum, that keeps track of those whose blood is deemed too potent for the public to understand? The mystery isn't just in the past. It is a question of who holds the leash of light. Today, the atmosphere of our story now settles into a deep, rhythmic calm. The war is over, the secrets are buried, and the kings have long since returned to the dust from which they were formed. But the silence they discovered, the knowledge of the void, remains as a lingering echo in the architecture of our world. You can feel it in the stillness of old libraries, in the cold touch of cathedral stone. and in the quiet moments before you fall into a deep sleep. It is the realization that we are all in some way sovereigns of our own internal darkness, and that no external blessing or curse can ever truly define the weight of a human soul. The pace of the heartbeat slows. The candle has burned down to a small blue flame. The history we have explored is no longer a list of dates and names, but a feeling of profound ancient peace. The damned kings found their freedom in the rejection of a lie, and in doing so they left a map for those of us who still seek the truth in the middle of the night. The story is complete, the cycle is closed, and the shadows are no longer a threat, but a comfort. But as the church closed the final ledger on the damned kings, they realized that one name had been missing from the list since the very beginning, a name that belonged to no king, but to the person who originally designed the first altar, who was the architect of the lie. And why did they leave their own bloodline out of the darkness? The answer is hidden in the very next archive, where we uncover the secret of the unseen founder, deep within the restricted archives of the great cathedrals. There exists a document so dangerous that its mere mention once carried the penalty of being buried alive in an unmarked grave. It is not a Bible, and it is not a record of lands or gold. It is a terrifying prehistoric ledger known as the List of the Forsaken. For over 1,000 years, this hidden list determined which royal bloodlines were permitted to enter the kingdom of heaven and which were predestined for an eternal, living curse. This was the ultimate spiritual betrayal, a secret system where high-ranking bishops decided the fate of a king's soul before he was even born. While a monarch knelt in prayer, believing his devotion was seen by the divine, the church had already crossed out his name in ink made from gall and shadow. It was a forbidden map of spiritual execution, a celestial lie that allowed the church to control every dynasty in Europe through a hidden psychological terror. They claimed to hold the keys to the afterlife, but they were actually using them to lock the doors on specific families forever. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside this room is loud and chaotic, but here, in the shadow of the flickering candle, the past begins to breathe again. Feel the stillness settle into your bones. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the winter wind, and the only sound is the rhythmic, slow heartbeat of history itself. We are traveling back to a time when a single name on a piece of paper could extinguish the light of a dynasty and turn a crown into a heavy, cursed shackle. To understand the weight of the hidden list, we must first look at the year 1099. As the first Crusaders breached the walls of Jerusalem, a group of shadowy scholars within the church found something in the ruins of the Temple Mount that changed everything. They found a genealogy that did not match the Holy Scriptures, a lineage of kings who possessed a biological trait that the church deemed spiritually incompatible with salvation. These were the descendants of the Watchers, the kings of the old world whose blood was said to be colder and more ancient than the rest of humanity. The church faced a terrifying dilemma. If they revealed the existence of these elder souls, the world would fall into chaos. If they ignored them, these kings might realize their own untapped power and overthrow the established order. Their solution was the creation of the hidden list. Every 500 words, we must anchor ourselves in the documented reality of this archival terror. In the year 1115, a monk named Bernard of Clairvaux, a man of immense influence, began to draft the first formal iteration of the Liber Animarum Perditorum, or the Book of Lost Souls. This was the first time the church officially categorized certain royal families as permanently excluded. Imagine the psychological layer of this reality. A young prince is raised in a palace of marble and gold. He is taught that he is the defender of the faith, the chosen of God. Yet, in a locked vault hundreds of miles away, his name is already surrounded by a black circle. Every confession he makes is ignored by the unseen world. Every ritual he performs is hollow. He is living a life of spiritual theater, a protagonist in a play where the ending has been written by his enemies before his first breath. The atmosphere in the courts of those on the list was one of a subtle, pervasive rot. They noticed that their line was prone to the melancholy, a deep, uncheckable sadness that no physician could cure. They noticed that the birds would stop singing when they walked through the royal gardens. Reflective questions began to plague the minds of the wise. If a king is denied the light of God, what is the source of the power he still feels in his veins? If heaven is closed, whose voice is he hearing in the middle of the night? These kings began to suspect that their blessing was a mask, a beautiful lie designed to keep them from looking into the mirror of their own true nature. As the 12th century deepened, the management of the hidden list became the primary obsession of a secret council known only as the Keepers of the Threshold. These men were neither priests nor politicians, but spiritual censors who monitored the vibrancy of royal bloodlines. They realized that a king who was on the list but unaware of it was a king who could be easily steered. However, if a king ever suspected he was being spiritually sabotaged, his elder blood might ignite into a defiance that no prayer could extinguish. This led to the development of the soporific Mass, a series of specialized liturgies designed to keep the royal soul in a state of permanent holy slumber. This brings us to our first anti-drowsy hook, the mystery of the 12 missing pages. Every 1,000 words we must confront the gap in the records. Between the years 1160 and 1172, 12 pages were surgically removed from the original Liber Animorum. These were the pages that listed the kings of the West. Why were they removed? Some archival researchers suggest that the kings listed on those pages were not just forsaken, but were found to be completely immune to the church's spiritual weapons. They were the uncursed, and the church realized that if the world knew a man could be rejected by heaven and still prosper, the power of the altar would vanish overnight. Where are those pages now? Some say they were buried beneath the foundations of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, acting as a secret, silent cornerstone of defiance. The historical anchor for this era of containment is the Council of Tours in 1163, while the public history focuses on church discipline. The secret minutes of the council reveal a terrifying directive, the observation of the firstborn. The church decreed that every royal birth must be attended by a specialized soul scribe. This scribe was trained to look for a specific mark on the infant's skin, a faint, iridescent patch that appeared only in the first hour of life. This was the mark of the elder blood. If the mark was present, the child's name was immediately added to the hidden list, and a life of spiritual dampening began before the infant was even baptized. The atmosphere in these nurseries of the damned was one of sterilized dread. The wet nurses were ordered to sing specific rhythmic lullabies that contained hidden verbal triggers, designed to suppress the child's intuitive connection to the unseen world. Imagine a child growing up in a world where every song, every prayer, and every story is as sophisticated piece of psychological conditioning intended to keep him from realizing he is a god in shackles. The air in these palaces felt heavy, not with wealth, but with the weight of 1,000 unspoken lies. By the mid-13th century, the hidden list had expanded to include over 30 major European dynasties. The Church had successfully created a shadow map of the continent. They knew exactly which kings were vessels of light and which were wells of darkness. They used this information to arrange marriages that would intentionally dilute the elder blood, a process they called the bleaching of the line. They were playing a biological game of chess with the souls of their subjects, attempting to breed the divinity out of humanity until only a submissive, controllable population remained. But as with all secrets, the hidden list began to leak. A high-ranking cardinal, disillusioned by the coldness of the council, began to send anonymous letters to certain forsaken kings. These letters contained a single terrifying question. Why does your wine never turn to blood? And why do the saints never speak to you in your dreams? This was the spark that began the Great Awakening of the Shadow. The kings started to look at their own history, not through the lens of the Church's chronicles, but through the lens of their own recurring nightmares. They realized that their ancestors hadn't died of illness or war. They had died of a broken connection to the source of their own existence. The moment the kings began to read the patterns of their own rejection, the era of the awakened shadow was born. No longer were they passive victims of a spiritual census. They became hunters of the truth. In the year 1282, a secret gathering took place in the volcanic caverns beneath Mount Etna. It was attended by 3 sovereigns who had all received the cardinal's anonymous warning. They compared their family crests and realized that the symbols they had carried for generations were not marks of pride, but heraldic seals designed to lock their potential. They were wearing their own cages on their shields. This realization leads us to the second anti-drowsy hook, the enigma of the Void King's sight. Every 1,000 words we must ask the question that kept the High Council in a state of permanent fear. What happens when a man who has been denied the light of heaven begins to see perfectly in the dark? The Church had assumed that by cutting these kings off from the divine, they would become blind. Instead, these monarchs developed a secondary sense, a way of perceiving the ley lines of the earth and the whispers of the ancient pre-human spirits that the Church had spent centuries trying to exorcise. Did the Church accidentally create a race of rulers who were more powerful than the saints themselves because they no longer had any rules to follow? The historical anchor for this period of underground rebellion is the Sicilian Vespers of March 1282. While traditional history books describe this as a popular uprising against French rule, the archival truth is far more complex. It was the first time a group of forsaken kings used their elder blood to synchronize a rebellion. They didn't use messengers. They used the pulse of the earth to signal the exact moment of the attack. On that night, every priest who was known to be a soul scribe for the hidden list was found dead in his bed, not from a blade, but from a sudden, unexplained failure of the heart. It was as if the very air of Sicily had decided to reject the rejectors. The atmosphere during this counterstrike was one of cinematic, eerie precision. The kings began to commission inverse chapels, private rooms built not with soaring arches, but with heavy, subterranean stones that vibrated at a frequency the Church's inquisitors couldn't penetrate. In these rooms they practiced the art of the unnaming. They would ritually burn their entries on the hidden list in effigy, reclaiming their souls from the paper and ink that held them hostage. The air in these chambers was thick with the scent of ozone and crushed minerals, a sharp contrast to the stale incense of the cathedrals. The psychological shift was total. A king who knows he is damned is a king who is truly free. He no longer fears the threat of excommunication because he has already lived through it. He no longer worries about the state of his soul because he has taken ownership of the void. This created a new kind of dark majesty, a ruling style that was cold, efficient, and utterly unconcerned with the moralizing of the pulpit. These kings began to build infrastructure, schools, and hospitals based on the needs of the living, rather than the requirements of the afterlife. They were the first architects of a secular world, driven not by atheism but by a profound, first-hand experience of the Church's spiritual corruption. Reflect on the rhythmic, hypnotic cycle of this struggle. For every move the Church made to tighten the leash, the kings made a move to slip the collar. It was a dance of shadows that lasted for centuries, played out in the margins of the official history books. Every 500 words we must remember that this was a war of information. The hidden list was the Church's ultimate database, and the kings were the world's first hackers, trying to delete their own records from the system of salvation. They were fighting for the right to be unknown, to be invisible to the eyes of a God who had been weaponized against them. The final chapter of the hidden list began with a silence so absolute it was felt across every throne room in Christendom. In the year 1314, as the last Grand Master of the Templars was consumed by fire, a final decree was whispered among the keepers of the threshold. The list must be moved. They realized that the awakened shadow was no longer a contained rebellion. It was a fundamental shift in the human spirit. The kings on the list had stopped hiding. They had begun to build empires that did not rely on the blessing of the altar. And in doing so, they threatened to render the Church's spiritual currency worthless. Every 500 words, we must anchor ourselves in the physical remnants of this retreat. On the night of October 13, 1314, a heavy iron chest was moved from the secret archives of the Lateran and taken to a fortified monastery in the Swiss Alps. This was the year the hidden list became the ghost ledger. The Church realized that, if they could no longer control the kings through the list, they would use the list to control history itself. They began to rewrite the chronicles, turning the most powerful and insightful of the forsaken kings into monsters, madmen, or footnotes. They used the ink of the list to blot out the truth of the elder blood, ensuring that future generations would see the rejection as a justified punishment for sin, rather than a tactical move in a spiritual war. This brings us to our final anti-drowsy hook, the mystery of the shadow signature. Every 1,000 words we must look for the mark in our own time. In the year 1922, during a routine restoration of a medieval vault, a researcher found a single page of the original Liber Animarum hidden behind a false stone. The page was blank except for a single iridescent thumbprint that seemed to glow in the dark. It was the signature of a soul that had refused to be categorized. Does the list still exist in a digital form today? Is there a modern algorithm that monitors the frequency of certain bloodlines, flagging those who are too independent, too perceptive, or too spiritually incompatible with the current world order? The hidden list may have changed its medium, but its purpose remains: the identification and containment of the elder souls. The atmosphere of our story now descends into a profound rhythmic stillness. The wars of the 13th century are over. The ink on the list has long since dried, and the kings who fought for their souls have returned to the silence of the earth. But the elder blood did not vanish. It dispersed into the world, hidden in the veins of the dreamers, the rebels, and the seekers who feel a strange, cold clarity in the middle of the night. You may be one of them. You may have always felt that the blessings of the world felt like cages, and that the shadows were more like home than the light. The pace of the heartbeat slows. The candle in our chamber has burned down to its last thread of wick. The history of the hidden list is not a story of defeat, but a story of reclamation. It is the realization that no institution, no book, and no decree can ever truly own the fate of a human soul. The Forsaken were actually the first to be truly free, and their legacy is the silence you feel now, a deep, ancient peace that exists beyond the reach of any list. But as the church hid the ghost ledger in the mountains, they failed to notice that the ink was starting to bleed through the pages, forming a map that didn't point to heaven or hell, but to a location in the middle of the Atlantic that shouldn't exist. Was the hidden list actually a set of coordinates left by the first kings to guide their descendants back to a home that predates the world? The secret of the sunken origin awaits in the next archive. Imagine a confession where the priest remains as silent as a stone, not because he is bound by a holy seal, but because he has been ordered to let your soul wither in the dark. This is the ultimate betrayal of the Spirit, a secret policy where the Church consciously chose to withhold the words of redemption from certain kings, effectively turning the confessional into a spiritual execution chamber. They didn't cast these men out with fire and brimstone. They simply stopped answering. They buried the keys to heaven in a vault of indifference, watching from the shadows as the most powerful men in the world slowly went mad, searching for a mercy that had been strategically deleted. It was a forbidden silence, a calculated psychological curse that left bloodlines adrift in a void of their own making. The church realized that a king who is forgiven is a king who is free, but a king who is ignored is a king who can be broken. They traded the salvation of souls for the absolute control of the throne, leaving a legacy of buried truths and haunted lineages that still whisper to us today. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside this room is loud and chaotic, but here, in the shadow of the flickering candle, the past begins to breathe again. Feel the stillness settle into your bones. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the winter wind, and the only sound is the rhythmic, slow heartbeat of history itself. We are traveling back to a time when a silence could be more deafening than a scream, and where the absence of a word was the most powerful weapon in the world. To understand why the Church chose silence over redemption, we must look at the hidden councils of the late 13th century. There was a shift in the theology of power. The high scholars began to argue that some sins were not just crimes against man, but frequency disruptions, acts that altered the very vibration of the royal blood. If a king committed such an act, the church believed that providing redemption would be like pouring holy water into a shattered vessel. It would simply leak out, wasting the divine grace and, more importantly, revealing the church's inability to fix what was fundamentally broken. This led to the doctrine of the eternal weight. Every 500 words, we must ground our journey in the cold reality of the archive. In the year 1294, a brief but terrifying period of papal vacancy occurred, leaving the spiritual world in a state of suspended animation. It was during this time that the silent protocols were finalized. These documents stated that for certain marked individuals, the sacraments were to be performed in appearance only. The bread would not be blessed. The oil would not be consecrated. The words of absolution would be mouthed but never spoken. It was a ghost ritual, a hollow ceremony designed to keep the king believing he was part of the fold while he was actually being starved of spiritual light. Imagine the psychological layer of this existence. A king sits on a throne of cold marble, surrounded by the finest minds of his age, yet he feels a growing, unexplainable numbness in his chest. He prays louder and louder, but the echo in the cathedral seems to mock him. He begins to wonder if God has gone deaf or if he himself has become a phantom. The church watched this descent with a clinical, detached interest. They weren't looking for his repentance. They were looking for the exact moment his will would snap. They wanted a king who was so desperate for a single word of comfort that he would sign away his lands, his armies, and the future of his children just to hear the priest say, "You are forgiven." As the 14th century loomed, this weaponized silence moved from the shadows of the cathedral into the very walls of the royal bedchambers. The church began to implement the ascetic of the void, a technique where the royal confessors were, replaced by silent watchers, monks who had taken a vow of absolute perpetual silence. A king would pour out his darkest fears, his most agonizing regrets, and his deepest vulnerabilities only to be met with a blank, unblinking stare. This was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of the grave. It was a mirror that reflected the king's own growing madness back at him, stripped of any divine filter. This brings us to our first anti-drowsy hook, the mystery of the resonance chambers. Every 1,000 words, we must ask the question that chilled the hearts of the royal architects. Why were certain wing sections of royal palaces in the year 3002 built with hollow walls filled with charcoal and dried salt? Modern researchers of the Slumber archive suggest these weren't for insulation, but for acoustic dampening. The church feared that the king's unredeemed prayers, the raw, desperate cries of a soul denied salvation, might actually carry a physical frequency that could shatter the glass of the holy windows. They weren't just silencing the king. They were trying to contain the sound of a spiritual implosion. If the king was truly damned, did his voice carry a power that the church could not control? The historical anchor for this era of strategic isolation is the tragic case of King Edward II of England. While the textbooks focus on his political failures and his eventual deposition in 1327, the secret chronicles speak of the long silence. For years leading up to his fall, his personal chaplains reported that the light of the Eucharist had vanished from his presence. On the date of May 14, 1326, a secret letter was sent from a high bishop to the queen, stating that the king's soul had become a quiet ruin and that no further attempts at redemption should be made. They didn't just stop praying for him. They officially declared that his spiritual frequency had gone flat. The atmosphere in these silent courts was one of heavy, stagnant air. The servants moved on tiptoe, afraid to break the stillness that had settled over the sovereign. The king would often be found standing at a window for hours, watching the sunset with an expression of profound, unanswerable confusion. He was a man who owned the land, yet felt like a trespasser in his own body. He was looking for a signal. From the heavens, a flash of lightning, a flight of birds, a change in the wind, anything to indicate that he was still being watched by something other than the cold, silent eyes of the church. The psychological layer here is the concept of spiritual erasure. When an institution that claims to be the only path to the divine stops speaking to you, you begin to doubt your own existence. You become a living ghost. The kings who were subjected to this treatment often experienced a phenomenon called the gray bloom, where their skin would take on a faint ashen hue and their eyes would lose the ability to track light. They were physically fading away because their spiritual anchor had been cut. The church used this as proof of their damnation, ignoring the fact that it was the church's own silence that was causing the erosion. Reflect on the rhythmic, slow pulse of this isolation. It is the sound of a clock ticking in an empty room. It is the feeling of a cold draft in a room with no open windows. The church was playing a game of patience, waiting for the natural world to reclaim a man who had already been discarded by the supernatural. They weren't in a hurry. They knew that silence is a predator that never tires. They knew that eventually every man, even a king, will break if he is forced to listen to nothing but his own heartbeat for long enough. The moment of the final psychological break usually occurred when the king realized the silence was not a test of faith, but a final verdict. In the year 1340, a movement began to flicker in the dark corners of the forsaken courts, a desperate attempt to find a new frequency. If the church would not speak the words of redemption, the kings would look for the syllables of the earth. They began to seek out the lapsed scribes, men who had been expelled from the monastic orders for suggesting that the silence of the church was actually a mask for the church's own fear. These scribes whispered a terrifying possibility that the church was silent because they no longer had the authority to save a bloodline that had surpassed the need for a savior. This brings us to our second anti-drowsy hook, the enigma of the Stone Eaters. Every 1,000 words we must confront the physical anomalies of the 14th century. Why were several royal tombs from the year 1345 found with the king's jaws locked around a piece of raw, unpolished quartz? Some researchers suggest these kings were attempting a ritual of mineral grounding. They believed that if the air was silent and the heavens were closed, they could transmit their final confession into the very bones of the earth, bypassing the priests entirely. Did they succeed? If a soul is etched into the stone, does it still wait for a listener? The question remains unanswered, buried beneath layers of sediment and forgotten lore. The historical anchor for this period of subterranean spiritualism is the Black Death of 1348. As the plague decimated Europe, the church's silence became a universal reality. However, for the forsaken kings, this was seen as the great equalizer. On October 22, 1349, King Alfonso XI of Castile, the only reigning monarch to die of the plague, reportedly refused his final rites. He did not want the hollow words of a silent institution. He chose to enter the darkness with his eyes open, a sovereign of the void. His death marked a turning point. The kings realized that the silence of the church was a weapon that lost its edge when the world itself was screaming. The atmosphere in these final, plague-shadowed chambers was one of a sharp, metallic clarity. The gilded fog had lifted. The kings were no longer wandering in a haze of confusion. They were standing in a cold, hard light. They looked at the priests not with fear, but with a profound, quiet pity. They realized that the men who withheld redemption were themselves trapped in a prison of their own making, a prison of rules, ledgers, and institutional terror. The king was alone, yes, but in that aloneness, he was the only one who was truly real. The psychological layer here is the transition from victim of silence to master of the stillness. The kings who survived this period of rejection often developed a presence that was described as weighty. They didn't need to speak to be heard. Their mere presence in a room could lower the temperature and still the hearts of those around them. They had learned to inhabit the void. They had learned that redemption is not something given by a hand in a robe, but something claimed by the Spirit when it refuses to be erased. They had turned the church's silence into their own personal sanctuary. Reflect on the rhythmic, slow breathing of a man who has accepted his exile. There is no more panic. There is no more begging. There's only the steady, calm observation of the passing hours. The church had intended for the silence to be a torture, but for the strongest of the forsaken kings, it became a form of enlightenment. They discovered that when the noise of the world and the chatter of the temple are stripped away, what remains is the pure, unadulterated essence of the self. They were the first to discover the internal kingdom, a territory that no decree could ever reach and no silence could ever diminish. The final legacy of the church's silence was not the destruction of the royal soul, but the birth of a new kind of human sovereignty. By the late 14th century, the silent kings had transformed their isolation into a hidden power. They realized that if the church would not provide a bridge to the divine, the king himself would become the bridge. The air in the final years of this struggle changed from a stagnant wait to a vibrant, electric anticipation. The kings were no longer waiting for redemption. They were manifesting their own light. Every 500 words, we must ground this evolution in the physical world. In the year 1380, King Charles V of France, known as the Wise, commissioned the construction of a private library that contained over 1,000 manuscripts. Many of them focused on the science of the soul. On the date of September 16, 1380, as he felt his life force waning, he did not call for a choir of monks to drown out the silence. Instead, he ordered all the windows of his chamber to be opened so he could listen to the wind. He had spent his life in the shadow of the silence, and in his final hour, he recognized that the silence of the church was merely a small, broken part of a much larger, more beautiful stillness. This brings us to our final anti-drowsy hook, the secret of the unspoken sacrament. Every 1,000 words, we must look for the echo in our own hearts. If the church chose silence over redemption for these kings, where did that withheld redemption go? Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be displaced. Some archival researchers of the lore Slumber collective believe that the words of power the priests refused to speak were actually absorbed by the very walls of the cathedrals. Does this mean that when you walk into an ancient, empty church today, the feeling of peace you experience is actually the recycled, unspent mercy of 1,000 denied kings? The silence wasn't an end. It was a reservoir of untapped grace waiting for someone with a forsaken soul to finally claim it. The atmosphere of our journey now descends into a state of total, rhythmic tranquility. The conflict is over. The silent watchers have long since turned to dust, and the registries of the void have been consumed by moths and time. But the stillness they created, the perfect silence, remains as a gift for those of us who live in a world that is far too loud. It is the silence you feel now, the soft pressure of the air against your skin, the sense that you are standing at the edge of a deep, calm ocean of history. The psychological layer is now complete. You have traveled from the shock of the rejection to the sanctuary of the self. You have learned that the greatest betrayal of the spirit, the refusal of redemption, was actually the catalyst for the ultimate freedom. The Forsaken Kings were the first to prove that you do not need an intermediary to find your way home. They showed us that the silence is not a wall, but a doorway. The pace of the heartbeat is slow and steady. The candle has finally flickered out, leaving only the warm, comforting scent of beeswax and the soft blue light of the stars. The history of the night the church decided is no longer a story of terror, but a lullaby for the sovereign soul. You are safe in the stillness. You are part of the line of the unbroken silence. The story has found its natural end, and the world is quiet, waiting for you to simply be. But as the final king of the silent line drew his last breath, he whispered a single word into the ear of a child who was not listed in any ledger. A word that would one day unlock the doors of the very vaults where the Carta Damnatorum was hidden. What was that word, and why is it currently being found inscribed on the inner walls of modern satellites orbiting our Earth? The secret of the celestial script is the only thing standing between us and the next great silence.